Let's jump in now with this background to the keys. So I made the claim, you've probably never heard of it if your experience is like mine, but is that true of all of church history? So no, it's not. In fact, the keys of the kingdom, this doctrine, was preached or written about by the early church fathers, that is, the prominent pastors and theologians after the apostles passed from the scene, and not just them, but the reformers and their various denominations. So for example, you can see here from the 2nd century to the 5th, here are these prominent names. Here's the addresses of where they were speaking, preaching, writing about the keys of the kingdom. You fast forward to the Protestant Reformation, and beginning with Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517, all the way down to the good old Particular Baptist Orthodox Catechism of 1689, you can see across denominations and across these eras and areas that the keys of the kingdom were prominent. These writings, these confessions, these catechisms were circulated among churches and served dozens, hundreds of millions of Christians in their areas as they studied these in their homes and talked about them in their churches and so forth. They were used to teach young believers in preparation for baptism or the Lord's Supper and so forth. So what I want you to see is that our era here in the American West, we are the odd one. We are the impoverished ones because the doctrine of the keys has not been thoroughly preached to us and taught. And the keys, again, summarize and symbolize what Jesus teaches on the church. And, by the way, the doctrine of the church is one of the least studied and most assumed doctrines of the last 150 years. So that's why I feel confident and not just hyperbole to say that this is one of the most important Bible doctrines you've probably never heard of. That's the background. But let's also consider this. That's a historical background, but let's actually jump into the Word of God and see the keys of the kingdom. Now, if you've heard of the keys, you know that in Matthew 16 and then Matthew 18, Jesus explicitly is teaching on the keys of the kingdom. He teaches by inference in other places, especially in the Gospel of Matthew. But here, look at Isaiah 22:2. Isaiah is in the middle of his prophecy, and he says, I will place on Eliakim's shoulder the key of the house of David. He shall open, and none shall shut. He shall shut, and none shall open. So it's a longer prophecy. There was a bad steward of the house of David, and so Eliakim's the new steward. But notice the house of David is idiomatic. It's symbolic of the Davidic kingdom, and it's opening and shutting, and it's this key to this house, the house of David, the Davidic kingdom. And he shall open, none shall shut. He shall shut, and none shall open. That's what keys do. They lock and unlock, they open, they shut. This is a prophecy, and guess to whom it's pointing? Well, Jesus. That's the Old Testament background, but then we jump right into the New Testament. Now, when you read the gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we'll look at two passages here, one in Luke, one in Matthew in a moment. Here is Jesus doing verbal battle, as it were, with the religious leaders, Pharisees, scribes, lawyers, and so forth. And if you've ever wondered why Jesus had such great conflict with them and held them to such a high account, it's actually these two verses really give us a glimpse. These two passages rather give us a glimpse into why. So here, Luke 11:52, look at what Jesus says. Woe to you lawyers, part of the religious leaders, for you have taken away the key of knowledge. You did not enter yourselves, and you hindered those who were entering. And the next, Matthew 23:13-15, parallel passage. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You neither enter yourselves nor allow those who would enter to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel across sea and land to make a single proselyte, a convert, right? They're evangelizing. And when he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves. That's the most fierce rebuke you can hear from the Lord. But notice in these passages that in Isaiah 22, the idea of the keys are rooted in the Old Testament promise regarding the house of David, and these keys open and shut David's kingdom, as you would expect. Notice also here in the Gospels, Luke and Matthew, the keys were held now by the religious leaders. And they were doing quote unquote evangelistic work, not in the same way that we Christians do, but they were traveling making converts, but they were making converts of hell. They're holding the keys of the house of David, also called the key of knowledge. They're shutting the kingdom of heaven. They're doing this work, and they're doing the exact opposite of what the Lord wants them to do. It's an anti-evangelism. They are not opening the door of God's kingdom, David's kingdom, to bring people in. They're locking it, they're shutting it, they're preventing people from coming in. They're stopping people. They're taking away the key of knowledge, the truth that will let people in to believe by faith. They are hiding. Hence, these severe and extreme pronouncements of Jesus. When he says woe in 11:52, that's essentially evoking a divine curse upon them. And what we're going to see is that Jesus' ministry revealed the proper use of the keys. It's a subtext to all the Gospels. Here we have Jesus healing and casting out demons and performing miracles, gathering disciples, drawing them together. Jesus' ministry is the opposite, the inverse of what the religious leaders were doing. They were wrong, Jesus is right, and it's all summarized in exercise wielding the keys of the kingdom.